Hi, welcome to my review of 1812, The Invasion of Canada, published by Academy Games. I've had this game a little while in my collection and I played it recently, so I thought I'd do a review. Before we have a look at the back of the box, I just want to call out the cover art. It's one of the things that drew me to the game. I think it's brilliantly done. Absolutely love it. So if we have a look at the back of the box, a few things are worth pointing out. One is that it is an area-based game, what I could call an area-based game, between 2 and 5 players, and that's interesting in itself. I don't have too many games in my collection of historical board games or war games that you can play with that many players. 1 to 2 hours, and I would agree with that. Key points: teamwork, and I'll talk about teamwork. It's definitely you can have a lot of fun with this game. With the team playing as teams with several people on each side. Easy to learn rules, yeah, I would agree with that. I'll talk a bit about the rules. The game definitely has educational merit as well, and it is a light, for someone who plays a lot of war games like I do, I would class this as a fairly light introductory level historical war game or historical board game. We'll have a look on the table. I'll go through some of the rules, and I'll talk a bit about what I've enjoyed about playing this game, both with a larger group, with a smaller group, and I have played it solitaire, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we'll start with the rulebook. Rulebook's not a huge number of pages. The game itself is as I said, sort of a light take on the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812, the invasion of Canada, is something that is not, I have to be honest with you, something that's not taught in the schools here in the UK, which I think is a great shame. I never learnt about it at school, and my children didn't, not at school. I have used this game as a way of sort of engaging them about this period of history, about the history of North America. It is part of the Birth of America series. If you have played some of the other games, there's a game on the American Revolution, there's a game on the French and Indian War, you'll be very familiar with the game system. Equally, if you've played 878, the Vikings game, which is around the invasion of England, you'll be familiar as well. As I said, the game, the rulebook itself, very straightforward to read. I had no problems at all. It's very neatly and methodically laid out. It does a really good job of explaining the key mechanics of the turn order, around movement, around using the cards, and I'll show you some of those. How the dice work, how moving the different forces around, gives you. And we're on page 6. Fundamentally, they're the rules that you're going to be needing. And then you get into the scenarios. There are a couple of scenarios. One is the scenario that I mostly play, if I'm being honest, which is the full campaign scenario. That's all the full turns. I'll talk more about that when we have a look at the board. You have a shorter introductory scenario, which Academy recommend that you play if you're new to the game. I have been through the introductory scenario a few times with new players, or when time is of the essence, so you don't have as much time to play the game. Definitely the full campaign, I would say you do need a couple. I'll be honest with you, you need a couple of hours. The introductory scenario is much quicker. And then you have, interestingly, an 1813 scenario set up, which I have done a few times now, and that's quite an interesting sort of extended scenario, which again has it's got more detail on the startup than the main campaign scenario. Then you have a absolutely brilliant historical overview of the War of 1812 to 1815. As I said, this is not in fact, I will go out on a limb and say I learnt about this period of history through wargaming. And I thoroughly enjoyed the historical overview here. It's very nicely written. It's quite detailed for a 4-page. It doesn't it does a really good job of explaining it succinctly, I would say, and I really enjoyed that. So yeah, very neat rulebook, well written, well laid out. This was not the first game in the series that I played. I played the American Revolution game first, so I was already familiar with the core mechanics. You don't need to have played any of the other games in the series. You don't need to have played them in chronological order. They're all completely standalone, and it does a really good job, I would say, of explaining the rules. It's easy to understand. I can recall playing this series of games for the first time, no problems at all, and I've had no problems explaining it to other people as well. It is a game that it's got a quick pace. The mechanics are quite decisive, and we'll have a look at the board next, and I'll talk more about the mechanics. So here I've got the game set up. This is sort of predominantly set up for the main campaign game, just as an example. It's a mounted map. We've played this game dozens of times now, and it looks as good as it did the day it came out of the box fresh, so that's great. The artwork on the map is beautifully done. It's very clear, all the different areas. It's very clear the contents of those areas to relating to gameplay, so the types of cubes that you use at the start, and if they're sort of key objectives, for example. We've got the lakes here, Lake Huron at the top there. Brilliantly done, beautifully done. Then in addition to the board, you get these coloured cubes. These represent the forces that are occupying those areas at that point in time. The different colours represent the 5 different, what do you want to call them, factions, I guess, for want of a better expression. So red for the British regulars, blue for the American regulars, for example, green for the Native Americans as well. In addition to the cubes that you can see here, you get a stack for more as you'll be bringing on reinforcements and so forth through the game. Then in addition, you have these coloured cubes. This, from a wargamer's point of view, this is sort of almost like a chit activation mechanic. Each of the 5 different forces has a coloured cube representing those. You put those in the bag, and you blindly pull them out through the turn. If you pull out, say, for example, a red cube, then the British regular player gets to have their go, effectively. It's a mechanic that I really enjoy. I really like it. And playing it with lots of people, there's always that trepidation of whose colour, whose dice. Dice isn't really the right word, but they're sort of dice-shaped. Is going to be pulled out of the bag next. It's a mechanic I really enjoy. Then you have all the combat dice. I'll talk a bit more about combat again. Nicely done, hard-wearing. They look great. It's very clear, as you can tell from the colours. For example, if we let's pick the British regulars. They're red. They have a red cube to act for their activation. They have red cubes to show their forces, and they are rolling the red combat dice. It's a mechanics very, very neat. And when you're bringing this game to new players and new players of historical games, it just helps the physical nature of the game. The common design language is really consistent, and that really, really helps with teaching new players and bringing new people into the hobby. And it's something that one of the things I think is really good about this game is just that attention, that thinking, that more deeper thinking about the design of the game and the implementation, production of the game. In conjunction with that, cards. So it is a card-driven game. Each player has a hand of cards. The cards themselves are beautifully done. So they have really nice illustrations and then gameplay effects. And I'll talk more about those in a second. But again, these have been played with dozens of times and have held up really well. I haven't sleeved them. You could do. Again, very nicely done. Really nice illustrations. Very clear contents of the card. Most of the cards are used to activate your forces and move them, and then when they end up in the zone with the opponent, there will be a battle. But there are other cards as well, with special events as well. And again, really clear contents. Each faction has its own card deck that they are pulling from as well. So you have 5 decks to use in the game. If you're playing 5 players, each person will be taking on a role of the relevant faction. So I may be playing with as the American regulars. My wife may be playing as the American militia, which can lead to great fun times when I come and talk about the team play with my kids playing the British regulars, the Canadian militia, and the Native Americans. So yeah, from a component point of view, beautifully done game, brilliant components as you'd expect from Academy Games. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics, or the core mechanics. I'm not going to describe every single nuance of all the mechanics. I'm sure there are other YouTube videos that do a way better job of that than I could. But I'll just give you the broad brushstrokes of how the game works. There are a series of rounds, and depending on the scenario you pick, depends on the number of rounds. The full campaign is 8 rounds, so that's why it takes quite a while to play. Each round, you put all these coloured cubes. I keep going to try and stop calling them dice, because they're not dice, but the cubes. You put them into the bag and you blindly pull out the cube. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that I pull out a blue cube here. This is the American regulars. I've got my American regulars, to help if I turn the cards the way around, I suppose. American regulars deck. I have a number of cards in my hand, and I'm going to use a card to activate some of my American regulars. Now, let's suppose I play this card. This is a normal card that I will be playing in the game. This enables me to activate 4 different, let's call them armies for the sake of argument in this video, 4 different armies, and I can activate 4, and I can move them all one zone. So, for example, this is a zone. Here's my army. It's got 2 cubes in it. One of those is the American regulars cube, and one of them is the American militia cube. But because it has a regulars cube in it, I can activate all of my cubes in here, including my allies. The allies being the American militia in this example. So I can move this, counting as one zone. Right? So effectively, what I am doing is I am moving my troops, but also the cubes of my colleague player. And this is where some of the fun comes in with the team play, because my team member who's playing the American militia might not want me to move into there, but I can do under the rules. So I can activate 4 and I can move them all one. Now, let's use this example here. And it's up to me which ones I activate, broadly speaking. And broadly speaking, then I can move them one. There are event cards that I can play to create different events and to make these more effective or move further and more dice or special rules. But broadly speaking, most of the cards you're going to be playing, and you'll be playing pretty much every time one of these types of movement cards in the game. Now let's suppose, for example, I have this card and one of the armies, for want of a better expression, that I'm going to be using a selection of forces. I'm going to move these cubes into my opponent's area there. When I've done all my movement, at the end of the movement, I will be doing a battle. So what I've effectively done, and let's just suppose I'm playing the American regulars and my good wife is playing the American militia. I have moved my American regulars and I've moved her American militia into a zone that contains my opponent's Canadian militia, British regular, and Native Americans. So you can already start to sort of see how some of the dynamics, the social dynamics of that team play is going to be working out. Maybe my ally, my American militia player, didn't particularly want to go into that zone. Well, that's the way the game is. I've moved the army, they don't get any choice. Equally, in their turn, they can move some of my American regulars if they so desire. And whilst we are playing on the same side, I've had a lot of fun with gamers who really enjoy that sort of team play dynamic mechanic. To do combat, again, it's very, very straightforward. So in this example here, I moved into let's just, for want of a better expression, call it the Canadian British controlled area. My opponents basically control the area. They will be rolling dice, combat dice, equal to the number of cubes that they have. And they will be rolling first because it's their area. So there's a green dice, 2 red dice, and 2 yellow dice for example. They'll be rolling those dice first. We'll play out the outcome of that combat, and I'll be rolling my dice. And in my case, if none of my cubes are removed, I'll be rolling 3 white dice and 1 blue. There is a limit of the dice. So, for example, if the British player had 3 red cubes and they're 3 British regular cubes, they'd still only roll 2 dice because that's all the dice there is, just 2. So it doesn't matter if they've got 10 or 20 or 2 or 3, it doesn't matter. The most they'll be rolling is 2. Now, the outcome of those dice, okay, I'll just talk about predominantly what the outcomes will be. A hit, in which case I will take away one of my cubes. As that player, I'll decide. I'll take one of my wife's American militia cubes away. The yellow dice, again, hits or a flee, and the player will place the yellow to represent the flee onto this fled units zone here. Not the end of the world. They will be coming back onto the game later, depending on the resolution of the cubes being pulled out. And you get another result, which is a space, which means there's no combat result, but the player can move those cubes into an adjacent controlled area, etc. Then, depending on the outcome, I'll be rolling my dice and so forth. So let's say I get, miraculously, which should never really happen. That's the, let's say I get 4 hits on my dice roll, and I eliminate all of those, moved off to the board. I now control that zone, and I will place one of these very handy control markers on there. I actually get 2 for that zone, to represent that now that belongs to the, let's call them American forces for now. In a nutshell, that's how the game works. Every activation I will be moving as the player that had that activation. So if I'm the blue player, I pull out the blue cube, I activate a number of my forces. I will be moving them about. There will be battles. There are event cards that I can use in conjunction. So let's say, for example, I can play an event card and a movement card at the same time. This card here, an enemy in one area that won a battle may move to a friendly or enemy adjacent area. This may result in another battle. Great, well, I just won that battle. So I could have played that event card and they would go and then move into that, and there'll be another battle then, for example. I'm kind of glossing the rules. You get the idea. It's a game about playing cards, using the cards to move and then fight. And the battles take minutes to resolve. And they are a lot of fun because of the results of the die. So, and can be quite eventful. So in particular, let's just say, the British player, if we compare the die for a minute, and this is an important mechanic, let's call them the British Canadian player, the red, so the British regulars, don't have a flee. Do not have a flee. So the, or fled icon. So as a British player, playing the British regulars, you know that in a battle, your red cubes are never going to be fled. They're either going to get destroyed or they're going to be victorious, or you can move them. And they have 3 results. 3 results are a hit. Let's compare that to the yellow, for example, which is the Canadian militia. They only have 2 hit results, and they have 2 fled results as well. So from a player's point of view, sorry for my Canadian friends out there, the Canadian militia are just not as effective in combat as the British regulars. The same is also true for the opposing players. The American regulars, they have 3 hit icons on their dice and 1 fled. So they're more likely to flee from a battle as the British are, because the British have no fled, but the American regulars do, compared to the American militia, which only have 2 hit icons and 2 fled icons. So, for example, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your troops, represented by the coloured cubes, is quite an important thing that you'll learn. The beauty of this game, I think, is that someone's completely new can enjoy it as much as someone who's played the game quite a few times. The player who's played the game for quite a few times will have obviously will have a sort of an advantage because I understand the mechanics and so forth. But through experience, having played the game with lots of players who've never played, I found that they've enjoyed it just as much as I have done on my 10th game, for example. So just some concluding thoughts. What I like about the game, all the production, the board, the cubes, the dice, the cards, the rulebook, brilliantly done, beautifully done. High quality product as you expect from Academy Games. Rules are very straightforward. They're very easy to understand. I've explained the game now to lots of different people. Some of those have never played a sort of historical war game before. Some of them have. No problem at all. It's great. I particularly like playing the game with the 5 players because it has that sort of group dynamic, that sort of teamwork. I use that word loosely sometimes, which is a lot of fun. The agency of the player, so how long it takes between turns, what am I doing while the other players having their turn, is really, really good. It's a fast playing game. When you're playing it, even with 5 people, you're not having to wait long before you're doing something and involved in the game in some meaningful way, whether that's through the battles, etc. So that's great. You can play the game 2 players or 3 or 4 for that matter. And you maybe at 2 players you lose a little bit of that team. We definitely do lose some of that team dynamic. 3 or 4 players, you that sort of starts to come back in as well. As a wargamer, I play nearly all my games at some point solitaire. I have played these games solitaire as well. It's a completely different experience in that respect. You're playing the game sort of 5-handed, and I'm playing it really for sort of a light war game to play in an evening, where the game's not too crunchy. There's some meaningful decisions to make, and I'm sort of playing what if scenarios, etc., etc. And I found that quite fulfilling. It's not a solitaire game. It's not designed for solitaire. There is no solitaire bot, etc. But I will play nearly all my war games in that way, and I enjoy them all. It's definitely on the historical side. There's historical content there. It is a light touch. That's good in the sense that it's a great sort of introductory level war game, board game for this period of history. For most of the people I've played this with, I've never really heard of the American invasion of Canada. So for that, it gets top marks because it helps them understand this period of history that they've never understood before. Well, how? Well, because through some of the gameplay, some of that event cards. Like I said, I like the historical references in the rulebook. That's all great. And it is a light touch. If you're looking for something that's more, if you're coming from a wargamer's point of view and you're looking for way more of a simulation or more detail, more chrome, this has got a little of that, but not maybe masses and masses of them, just being honest about that. There are other options that I've got in my collection that have all that if I'm comparing them to. But it's not designed for that. It's designed to play, if I'm being honest, with friends, with family, having fun, engaging mechanics, and a light touch into the history to help understanding and some education from that point of view. And for all those things, it does it brilliantly well and is a lot of fun. Probably, if I think about, playing games with family and friends, they see my massive war game collection and like, oh, well, help us understand what this is about. This is one of the types of games I would reach for to show, hey, let's play this, and you'll understand what playing these sort of games is all about at a introductory level. And when I've done that, every single person I have played this with has thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think that's the mixture of the quality of components, that agency around the player turn, the simple to understand but quite meaningful, quite deep mechanics, especially once you've played a few turns, even someone new, and they're going, oh, okay, I understand. Maybe moving my 2 or 3 cubes against your 10 isn't such a good idea. Maybe not such a good idea. They understand that, and it becomes apparent quite quickly. And some of that depth around some of the card play, when to use certain events. One of the things I didn't mention actually in the turn, even though the number of turns is quite long, what determines the victory at the end is the number of zones that are controlled. And the last turn on all the games I've played are righteous fun as people are trying to grab on to the last bits of territory for the last turn. The last turn is actually determined, can be the last turn. It can end early, as every side has a treaty card to play. And if all treaty cards are played, then the game finishes. So it doesn't always go through its full length of duration. And again, that can be quite interesting, especially in a social group mechanic. So the game has all that in spades. So yeah, like I said, Played it with my family. I don't really play, my teenage boys will play war games with me, but this does all that. As a family game, brilliant fun, bringing someone into the wargaming hobby, historical board games, learning more about the history, brilliant fun too. So yeah, high recommendation for me as ever. I'd love to know some comments, people who've played the game series, and thanks for watching as ever.